Chapter 4. A Startling Figure. I'll renew my search for the missing compositions at once, Nancy decided. On her way to the attic, she stopped to say good morning to Susan and Mr. March. The little girl was sitting up in bed, a big grin on her face. She was listening to her grandfather tell stories. "The doctor says I'm almost better, Nancy," the child said happily. "I'm sure I can get up soon, and I'm never going away from here again. Ever!" Mr. March's eyes glistened with tears, and Nancy was sure she knew what he was thinking. She opened her purse and took out a check made out to the order of Philip March. "For me? From Mr. Faber's antique shop?" the elderly man asked, not understanding. "For your table and hat boxes, the ones my friends and I found in your attic. I had no idea they were worth so much. This will tide us over for some time. And now I'm going to search for something even more valuable, the music." Nancy smiled. "I'm sure you won't find it," Mr. March declared sadly. "It's been stolen, I'm afraid." Nancy did not tell him how near the truth she thought he might be. She said nothing about the mysterious prowler. Instead, she urged Mr. March to be hopeful. Nancy realized the mystery would be a long way toward being solved if the elderly gentleman could identify some of the tunes on radio programs. He had no television set, and his one radio did not work very well. "Mr. March, suppose I bring my portable radio out here tomorrow," she said. "Carry it around with you all the time. You may hear more of your son's songs." "That's very thoughtful of you." Nancy straightened the covers on Susan's bed, then said she would start her hunt on the 3rd floor. "My friends and I didn't have a chance to do much searching in the attic the other day," she told Mr. March. "I guess if the music is in this house, it'll be up there." "You may be right, but be careful." When Nancy reached the top of the narrow stairway, she turned on her flashlight and looked about, wondering where to begin her hunt. The place seemed even more spooky than the previous time she had been there. There was a musty odor in the attic. As she stepped forward to open a window, the floorboards groaned. Nancy decided to begin her search in an old horsehide trunk. She lifted the lid and saw a yellowed wedding gown of rich brocaded satin. This lovely dress must have belonged to Susan's grandmother, she thought. Alongside the gown lay half a dozen old-fashioned pictures. One of them instantly struck Nancy as familiar. "I believe this is a Currier and Ives. Yes, here's the name to prove it." Her heart leaped, for she knew how eager collectors were to buy these old prints. "What luck this is," she smiled. "Wonder what else I can find here that could be sold." Nancy had been so busy she had failed to notice a lowering thunderstorm which had been coming nearer and nearer. Now it broke over the old house in all its fury. "Guess I'd better close this window and then help shut the ones downstairs," she thought, stepping across several boxes to reach the dormer. After securing it firmly, she went toward the stairs and started down. Just then she heard a splintering sound, followed by a crash which shook the old March mansion convulsively. Below was pandemonium. Susan was crying loudly, Effie was shrieking, and Mr. March was shouting, "Nancy! Nancy, are you all right?" The girl hurried down and assured him she was unharmed. She in turn was relieved to find the others safe, but Susan was trembling with fright. The little girl had gotten out of bed and scampered into the hall. Now she clung piteously to Nancy. "I don't want to stay alone," she wailed. Something fell on the house by my window." Nancy stroked the child's head soothingly. She asked what had happened. Mr. March, already on his way down the broad staircase to the first floor, replied that he thought one of the big pine trees had blown over and struck the house. The lightning did it," declared Effie, terror in her voice. "Chin up, Effie," said Nancy. "Let's all of us go downstairs and see what happened." She got Susan's bathrobe and slippers, then together they followed Mr. March. He called to them to come into the music room. Out of a window they could see one of the tall pines leaning against the mansion. As soon as the rain stopped, Nancy and the elderly man went outside to see what damage the fallen tree had caused. "Very little harm done," said Mr. March. "This house is well built. That's a heavy tree. I'm glad it didn't fall on your car, Nancy." "I am too," she replied. "If you'd like me to, I'll go to a garage and get some men to bring a wrecker up here and pull the tree away from the house." "That would be a good idea, but the expense—" "I know a man who won't charge much," said Nancy. "And that reminds me, I found some more things up in the attic to sell, a dozen or so pictures." She hurried to the attic and gathered up the old prints. "Do you recall these?" Nancy asked Mr. March. "They were stored in the horsehide trunk. They'll bring a good price." "You mean they're worth money?" "Indeed they are. Mr. Faber will be glad to get them. I've only begun my search of the attic. Let's hope there are many more saleable treasures up there." "I take it you didn't find any of Phipp's music?" "Not yet. I'll have another look tomorrow," Nancy promised. As she was about to leave the house, Effie came running toward her. "Oh, Miss Nancy, you're not going to be away long, are you?" she cried out. "I won't draw a comfortable breath till you return." "I'll be back in the morning." "Morning?" Effie shrieked. "I can't stand it here without you. Creaking sounds, men prowling about at night. Oh, Miss Nancy, please come back and sleep here." "I'm afraid if it's as bad as you say, I won't be able to sleep." The young detective grinned. "Well, I'll try to get back," she said, and went to her car. Her first stop was Leonard's garage. The owner had equipment for removing fallen trees and promised to go out to Pleasant Hedges at once. Then Nancy went on to Faber's antique shop and received a sizable check for Mr. March. Finally, she dropped into her father's office to tell him her plans and also to report what had happened at the March mansion. "You say Effie saw a man prowling about?" Mr. Drew asked. "Yes," Nancy replied. "And I found footprints going around the house." "I don't like that," said Mr. Drew. "If you go back to the mansion, Nancy, I don't want you to take any unnecessary chances." "I won't." Nancy hugged her father and left his office. Before going home, she bought a few toys for Susan. Later, she packed them, together with some groceries, and the portable radio and her clothes, in a suitcase. After an early supper, she drove back to Pleasant Hedges. "Oh, I'm so relieved to see you," Effie cried. Presently, Nancy turned on her radio to a station which was broadcasting popular music. She asked Mr. March to listen carefully. "Perhaps you'll hear the song you recognized the other night," she suggested. "If you should, please jot down the station, the orchestra, and, if it is announced, the name of the composer." "Nothing would please me more than to expose the impostor," Mr. March declared. "I want the world to know Phipp wrote that song." The elderly man carried the radio upstairs. Meanwhile, Nancy decided to do some more hunting in the attic. Unfortunately, her flashlight battery was dead, so she went to the kitchen for a candle. Effie began to chatter. This house ain't so bad in the daytime, but when it starts getting dark, the shadows just sort of leer at you. Nancy laughed. Nonsense! She opened a cupboard and took out a long white candle. Effie looked at her questioningly. What are you planning to do now? There's no light in the attic, explained Nancy, and my flashlight battery is dead. You're not going up there tonight, Effie exclaimed, aghast. I'm sure nothing will happen to me, Effie, and I want to help Mr. March if I can. The maid shrugged her shoulders in resignation as Nancy set the candle in a holder. She left the kitchen, went to the second floor, and stopped at the foot of the attic stairway. There she touched a match to the wick and held the candle high in her hand as she ascended cautiously. Just as she reached the top of the steps, the light went out. Nancy's heart began to pound. Was someone up there? She shook off her momentary fear. It was only a draft from that leaky window, Nancy told herself. She struck an extra match and relighted the wick. Nancy stepped into the attic. The candle flickered again and nearly went out. Something moved. My own shadow, of course, she reasoned. But how grotesque I look. Nancy's eyes focused on a massive wardrobe which stood against the far wall. I'll search that first, she decided, crossing the attic. Setting the candle on the floor, she grasped the knob of the door and pulled. Wonder what I'll find, she asked herself. The door did not give. At the same moment, there was a creaking sound. Nancy could not tell where it had come from. She picked up the candle and looked around. It's nothing, I'm sure, Nancy told herself, but she could not shake off the uneasy feeling that had come over her. Once more, she put down the candle and tugged at the door. It gave suddenly, swinging outward on a squeaky hinge. From within, a long, bony arm reached out toward Nancy's throat. End of Chapter 4.